Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Woodside, and this is my presentation on the LGBTQ experience in the armed forces. Now, while members of the LGBTQ community have always existed in the armed forces, there haven't always been rights and protections within the armed forces for those individuals. In the United States Armed Forces, official bans on individuals who identify as gay or queer date back all the way to the early 20th century. The United States first introduced a ban in a revision of the Articles of War in 1916. This was in an effort to prevent members of the LGBT community from serving. Also, the U.S. military instituted additional tests such as physical exams and interviews to help weed out homosexuals. These tests were used to spot men with characteristics that were deemed feminine during the recruitment. If a soldier or recruit was accused of being gay or exhibited homosexual behavior, they could be discharged. These discharges were not honorable, they were dishonorable discharges, and they could also be labeled as sexual psychopaths. This was in an effort to prevent any benefits being provided to those individuals as they exited out of the military. The military also made the act of sodomy a crime and made that crime subject to punishment by court-martial. This treatment of those in the LGBT community created an unsafe environment. That environment led many in the LGBT community to stay closeted if they still wanted to serve. Many strong, prideful Americans were forced to hide their true identity in order to serve their country. This forcing of individuals to stay in the closet was in fear of being discharged and losing their veteran benefits, or in some cases, worse. This stance by the military lasted for decades, with the Department of Defense reaffirming the ban on those in the LGBT community in 1981. In 1992, President candidate at the time, Bill Clinton, began to push the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. According to eventual President Clinton, this was in an effort to draw a compromise between those who wanted to end the long-standing ban on LGBTQ community members serving in the U.S. military and those closed-minded individuals who felt having openly gay troops would hurt the morale or even cause problems within the military ranks. This turned out to be no true fix, as in time it was seen that it forced many individuals to still live in secrecy and did little to address the prejudice experienced by those individuals. Also, many men and women found themselves still discharged. In reality, the policy did little to change the behavior of the commanding officers toward service members they suspected of being part of the LGBT community, and it was found evident by the realization that by 2009, more than 13 military personnel were discharged by identifying either as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. In 2010, President Obama signed the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This repeal meant people who identify as LGBTQ could serve openly in the military. This was fully implemented in 2011. In 2013, it was ruled unconstitutional to define marriage to be openly between a man and a woman and granted the state's authority to define marital relationships. Previously, in 1996, the Defense of Marriage Act was passed, and this stated that marriage or legal unions are between one man and one woman. Also, in 2013, the court ruled that legally married same-sex couples are entitled to federal benefits, which was not the case previously. In 2015, the court ruled that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples. This ruling mandated that states to allow same-sex couples married legally. In 2015, Ash Carter, Secretary of Defense, issued a directive that no service member will be discharged only because of their gender identity. Discharge needed approval of the Under Secretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. A year later, in 2016, Secretary Carter removed the ban that previously placed on transgender individuals serving openly in the military. In 2018, the first transgender individual signed a contract to join the U.S. military, and in that same year, the Trump administration announced a new policy that banned trans people from serving in the military, which took effect in January 2019. In the middle of the year 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal law protects LGBTQ workers from discrimination. Also in this year, the court ruled that policies segregating transgender students from their peers are unconstitutional and violate federal law prohibiting sex discrimination. Discrimination against people based on their gender identity and sexual orientation violates the Title 8 of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964. In early 2021, President Joe Biden signed an executive order to repeal the 2019 Trump administration ban regarding transgender individuals joining the military. With the ban now officially removed, there are still things to worry about being a service member in the military. Service members in the military experience high numbers of sexual harassment and sexual assault. RAND.org research report states, service members who identify as LG or B and who do not indicate that their identity as heterosexual represent only 12% of the active component population in 2018. But they accounted for 43% of all sexually assaulted service members in that year. The 91% of men who identify as heterosexual only accounted for 52% of all men who were sexually assaulted over a 1-year period. The remaining 9% of men who did not indicate heterosexual orientation accounted for 48% of all men who were sexually assaulted. The 77% of women who identify as heterosexual only accounted for 60% of all women who were sexually assaulted over a 1-year period, while the remaining 23% of women who did not indicate a heterosexual orientation accounted for 40% of all women who were sexually assaulted. These numbers are only based on sexual assault. This does not take into account the sexual harassment, stalking, and other things that take place in the military. A study was conducted with the support of the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health and Affairs through the Psychological Health Traumatic Brain Injury Research Program. This study states victimization was common among members of the LGBTQ community. Hate crimes happen everywhere. Hate crimes committed to the LGBT community are a twofold problem. These hate crimes happen against those in the LGBT community because they are targeted crimes. These crimes are happening on the basis of who the individual is and who they choose to love. Both things that someone cannot change. Secondly, these targeted hate crimes happen to the members of the LGBT community because of the military's response. Far too often, attacks on those who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender go ignored. Assailants go unpunished, and crimes are swept underneath the rug. When these egregious acts happen, one time is one time too many. Yet, for some reason in the military, it can feel like commonplace. The fear of physical and sexual assault is very real for those in the LGBTQ community. Not to mention the less violent attacks like threats, intimidation, and vandalism to personal property. How the military addresses, punishes, and rectifies these situations is the only way to truly stop that from happening for good. As a U.S. community, we all know somebody in the military. Those in the LGBT community are more likely to serve. Those that identify as transgender are twice as likely to serve in the military than their heterosexual counterparts. The military already gets tons of support from all over. That being said, there are additional actions that we can take to be allies to our brothers and sisters in arms that identify as LGBTQ. One thing is being more active in voting. That includes our local election. Congress plays an important part in passing bills, and those bills have the power to change past wrongdoing as present wrongdoings that exist. For example, there is the Restore Honor to Service Members Act. This bill will help many former service members who were discharged for their sexual orientation. It would correct the discharge and change their official military record to reflect an honorable discharge. For many, that would allow them to recompensate missed pay, health insurance, and other missed benefits caused by the dishonorable discharge. Also, there is the Charlie Morgan Military Spouses Equal Treatment Act. This bill allows benefits for legally married same-sex veteran couples. This also covers families of soldiers in the event of an untimely death during service, a benefit that's already provided to heterosexual couples. Also, we as citizens can demand harsh punishments for hate crimes and any acts of violence committed to soldiers based on their sexual orientation. We can demand that justice is served and no longer allow assailants to go free. Crimes cannot be swept under the rug, and former injustices must be accounted for. Lastly, LGBTQ equality in the armed forces is not merely an issue of fairness. It's about facing the reality that the LGBTQ Americans serve in uniform. They have been forever. They make the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of this nation for us all. That fight for freedom is just like their heterosexual counterparts, side by side, brothers and sisters in arms.